what truly motivates you? Have you ever spent time to think about what really motivates you in life? If we're truly honest with ourselves, it might just be our routine, that we don't think about the motivation day to day. We just go about our routine and do the things that are in front of us and that we're faced with. But if we were truly honest and to search inside, we might ask ourselves whether money motivates us to earn as much as we can. Whether it's getting a certain position in life or a promotion at work or having the things that make us look successful in life to other people. Maybe it's simply praise or to be celebrated by others or recognition. When I was much younger, high school days, I used to think about what it was I wanted to do with my life. And I had several options. Of course you do when you don't have to actually go get a job. And some of the options were, I really thought maybe I wanted to be a newscaster or a television personality. Whether it was news or sports, it definitely wouldn't be weather because that has science involved in it, although some would argue. I wanted to do something that would put me in front of people, and I realized that almost everything I thought about back in those days was just having a position of influence. That I'd be up in front of people, and that people might actually listen to what I had to say and might do what I was advising them to do, or at least think about what I was telling them to think about. It wasn't necessarily super selfish, but it was selfish. It was to be in that position of influence. And so, what are you motivated by? Obviously, as a kid, things have changed, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we're all motivated by something, aren't we? We do everything we do because there's some internal or external motivation working in our life, and if our motives are left unchecked, they can turn inward. They can turn so that we begin to ask, well, what's in it for me? If I do this, what's in it for me? We sometimes think we'll begin to work for the praises of people if they're left unchecked. That maybe I start doing things and I get a pat on the back and I really like that and I keep going because I want to. Or maybe we tend to think or want to think about being recognized, just recognized for our work. It may not be a praise, it may not be this high praise or celebration, but just being recognized. You know, thanks for doing that, or good work, or whatever it may be. It's human nature to want to be recognized. It's human nature to want to be appreciated and for people to see us. In Jesus' time, he's addressing the religious leaders because that had become their primary motivation. To be recognized, to be seen, to get the praise of people, to be above, a notch above those who they were leading. They gave, they prayed, and they fasted so others would see them, Jesus says, and to see how special they thought they were. They believed this was the way, and they believed that when they did it, they were being religious. And so they did it religiously. They had turned their faith in God into a form of religiosity, which is an actual word, but religiosity in this case I'm using to refer to religion for religion's sake. It wasn't about anything more than being seen and following the rules, as we talked about last week. Last week we said, they had come up with so many rules and regulations that they needed rules and regulations to interpret the rules and regulations, and it was getting complicated. And what Jesus begins to teach his disciples in today's passage and the two sections right after it is that this does not lead us closer to God. It leads us where it led the scribes and the Pharisees and the leaders of Jesus' time, seeking recognition and praise. When you begin to follow the rules for the rules' sake, you check off your boxes and you pat yourself on the back and you want others to do the same thing. And it can be the same way in our time today. There's good news, though. Jesus teaches good news, that there's a different way. And so when Jesus says these words, Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to, or for the purpose of, being seen by them. Then you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. He says, so whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. Don't draw attention to you, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. That's all they're going to get. And when he goes on to teach more about that and then moves on to prayer, and then after that fasting, he's saying to them that true religion is about relationship, not recognition. We don't want to seek recognition. We want only to seek the praise of God. And it's about the relationship that we have with Jesus that matters. Jesus tells his followers that religious life is more than being seen, of following all those rules and regulations and being acknowledged in public as the best of the best. Instead, true religion is about a relationship with God. It's motivated by the fact that God is in relationship with us and we're in relationship with God, and that because of that relationship and the one who sees into our very soul and created us to be who we are, that when we are truly seen by God, that relationship then motivates us to go out and live a life for God. So what motivates us to live for God? Jesus addresses that. He teaches us that motives matter. Motives matter. In our relationship with God, how we approach the relationship is super important, and how we live out the relationship is as important as ever. And so Jesus begins to teach about what the Jewish folks in that day and in this day would know as the three great pillars of faith. The three great pillars of the religious life in Judaism were almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. These are the three religious practices that kind of supersede everything else. If you're doing those, everything else will come from it. And so Jesus is concerned that these pillars had begun to be about recognition instead of the relationship. It was about wrong motives for them. And so Jesus addresses that. He teaches the disciples then and now, you and me, how to give, how to pray, and how to fast within the bounds of a relationship and not recognition. He addresses within that teaching then the notion of reward. Why do we do things? Most of the time we do things not just because we're so intrinsically and ethically great that we can do it all without even thinking of ourselves. Most of the time we want a reward. And some people say that Christians shouldn't worry about reward. But reward is something Jesus is teaching. He says if you do it the way the scribes and the Pharisees do it, you'll receive no reward other than the praise of the people that you're doing it in front of. And even then, they might not be praised. Have you ever met somebody who always thinks they're right and is always doing the right thing and wants you to praise them because they're the one doing right all the time? It's annoying, isn't it? It is. Because no one's ever always right. And so no one's ever going to always get the praise of the people around them. And when they do, that's all they're going to get, Jesus says. Because that's the wrong motivation. Jesus is teaching that we will be rewarded, but in a very different way. William Barclay, who's the Bible scholar who I've been kind of reading through this whole Sermon on the Mount, he says, anything which achieves nothing is meaningless. So why would we do anything if there's nothing in it for us? Well, altruistically, we would say because it's the right thing to do. But we're not altruistic most of the time. And God knows this. God knows that in relationship, there's things that you do for each other. God first loved us, we love God. And there is reward involved, both positive and negative, Jesus teaches. If you enter into this with the wrong motives, you'll receive the reward that necessarily you were after, but not the one that will be the best for you. And so reward makes sense in life. Chaos would ensue if no negative or positive reward ever took place, because what you reward gets repeated. So God doesn't value the people who stand out in public and seek only the reward of the people around them, because it's only about the one relationship that really isn't the most important relationship in all of eternity. God values and rewards relationship. Jesus teaches, I'm the vine and you're the branches. If you remain in me, I'll remain in you. That's relationship. It wasn't a science lesson. It was a relationship lesson. And so Jesus didn't also mean a material reward, as gets taught sometimes. I've told you before, I have dogs. I have 2 basset hounds, and they are highly food motivated. That's their motivation. One of my dogs, the oldest, Beatrice, will sit in the kitchen the whole time you're in the kitchen, just hoping that something will fall on the floor or you'll have a weak moment and give her a bite. But when we put them away in their crates, if we're going out, because you don't leave basset hounds loose in the house, I get a treat for them, and I show them the treat, and I tell them to follow me. And we go in, I make them get in their crate, and then they get a reward, and then they get locked up. And every time they're so excited to get the reward, and when they get to the reward and they get it finally and the door's closed, they eat the reward and they look at me like, not again. Yes, they got the reward, but that's it. And God values the relationship more than just the reward. Job contradicts the fact that we sometimes think there will be a material reward by the fact that Job lost everything. God said to Satan, test him, and this one follows me because he loves me and believes in me, and it's about a relationship. And so we read all through Job, and his friends tell him how, well, maybe it's because you're doing it wrong. And Job's like, I'm not doing it wrong. Trust me, I'm not doing it wrong. And at the very end, we see that Job finally gets to talk face to face with God in the whirlwind and realizes that God does have his best interest in mind, that God is there with him and was never not there with him. Because in my paraphrase, God looks at Job and says, well, where were you, Job? Where were you when I spun this whole world into motion and created everything in it that you see and the things even you don't see? Where were you, Job? And Job realizes his very limited knowledge of how God works and who God is, and basically says to God, you know, you're right. I need to trust you. I need to continue to trust you. And of course, you know how it ends up for Job. But it wasn't about the material reward. It was about relationship. Relationship with God. And so Jesus says those seeking the material reward or the outward recognition or the praise of people, that they've been paid in full. It's not going to get any better than that. And so William Barclay writes, Jesus is saying if your one aim is to get yourself the world's rewards, no doubt you will get them. But you must not look for the rewards which God alone can give. And that one would be a sadly short-sighted creature who grasped the rewards of time and let the rewards of eternity go. Does that sound familiar? Listen to the words of Jesus in Mark chapter 8, verses 35 to 37. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? It's not about gaining the world or the recognition of people. It's about the relationship we have with God by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Our reward as followers of Christ looks more like knowing that we did the Christ-like thing. And I would just add that we ought to check ourselves to know if we're doing the Christ-like thing when we do something before we do it. We ought to ask ourselves, is this what Jesus would do? Not necessarily the "what would Jesus do" moniker, but how can I be the most Christ-like person in this situation? And how does that tell me what to do? Our reward as followers of Christ would be then that we have more opportunities to be Christ-like, that God would trust us with giving us more and more opportunities to show the love of Christ and to be the love of Christ for the people around us. And our reward as a Christian follower of Christ is the experience of God's presence, the fullness of Christ in our life, more and more and more. It's about a relationship, not recognition. And our motives matter. And so part of that is asking ourselves, as Jesus put to his disciples, do we follow Jesus or do we do anything in life out of a sense of duty? We have to do it. It's just what we're supposed to do. Or do we do it out of a desire for prestige, that people might see us and recognize us and all of that? You know, when I was a brand new Christian, I had gone to church for the first time and gave my life to Christ the first time I went back to church. And in the weeks following, I felt a very clear call to vocational ministry as a pastor. And I prayed that God was wrong for about 6 years. Honestly, 6 years. Because I've made the choice to stay in the pulpit, but the pastor who I came to Christ under stood out here. I know the camera folks are going crazy. I'm sorry. And he stood out here, and he stood before me in this robe, and he was probably 6'1", 6'2", white flowing hair, which I obviously don't have, and very good preacher, very good presence and eloquent in his delivery. And I looked at that and I thought, I can't be that. So obviously you've got it wrong, God. Now, it was not his motivation or intent to stand in front of me or anyone else as if he had prestige. He was following the call to ministry and he was leading well. But I hadn't realized that at that point. Because it's easy, as the scripture points out, to want to do something for the praises of other people. And if you're really good at it, people might think that's what you're doing. Because the way they prayed in that time was to stand out with their arms up, their head down, and just pray as loud as they could on the street corner or in the streets, wherever they were, even in the synagogue, so other people would look at them and say, wow, they're really religious. They're really good at that. And so my pastor was really good at it, and I thought, I can't be that. And I learned really quickly that God wasn't asking me to be that. He was asking me to be me. And so every Sunday, every day I get up and try and be your pastor, all I'm doing is trying to be faithful to who God called. Because I believe, as Jesus taught, that this comes from a relationship. It's out of the overflow of love and kindness in my life and in your life that we can be Christ-like at all. We can't help but give our gifts, whether it's almsgiving, praying, fasting, whatever it might be. We can't help but do it because it's out of the overflow of all that God has poured into us that we live our life. I was paraphrasing some of the teachings that William Barclay had in his stuff and other things that I've looked at this week, and I wrote this. It says, there you have real giving, praying, and fasting. All of these which come from an upsurge of love in the heart of a person, which is a kind of overflow of the love of God in their life. Our giving, our praying, our fasting must never be the grim and self-righteous outcome of a sense of duty. Still less, it must never be done to enhance our own glory and prestige among people. They must be the instinctive outflow of the loving heart. We must give, pray, and fast out of a motivation to love God and others as Jesus Christ gave himself for us. So we need to ask ourselves this morning, what is our motivation for following Jesus? In the previous section we looked at last week, Jesus said, "You've heard it said." In other words, there's a rule or regulation that says, do this, that, or the other thing. But I say, and he makes it very clear, that it was more about following God than following the rule or regulation. This week, Jesus is saying, you've seen it done by the scribes and Pharisees, but I say, do it this way. You know, when I was younger, I really wanted to have a position of influence, the public eye, if you will, or one that the rest of the community would look at me and say, well, he's doing pretty well, or he's in a good position. But I grew up, and I gave my life to Christ, and I recognized that it was so much more about being faithful to Jesus. And so, yes, I believe God gave me a position of influence. I do believe pastors have influence in the lives of the people in their care. But to me, it's more about a relationship than being recognized. And I think that's the question we have to ask is, am I motivated by my love of God and God's love of me? And am I motivated by helping to lead people into a deeper relationship and deeper love of Jesus? And if we can answer that, then we truly have recognized that religion is much more about a relationship than it is about recognition, and that our motives matter.